Hello and welcome to this episode of the Climate Economy from The Hindu. I am Kunal Shankar. The global plastics treaty talks in Geneva have collapsed again as major plastic producing nations, including the United States and Saudi Arabia, opposed production limits and chemical restrictions. India backed them as part of what is being called the like-minded group, one of the two opposing blocs in this debate. The negotiations held between August 4th and 14th were the sixth round of talks convened under the United Nations Environment Programme. The global plastics trade is worth over 1.1 trillion US dollars a year. Annual production now exceeds 460 million tons, of which only about 9% is recycled, while nearly 20 million tons leak into our lands, rivers, and oceans annually. The failure in Geneva highlights the urgency for binding action to address what is fast becoming not only an environmental issue but a health crisis. To break down what happened and why, I am joined by Jacob Koshy, the Hindu's deputy science editor who attended the UN talks in Geneva and has been reporting on this process since it began in 2022.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So why don't you first give us a background of what this whole issue is, and then maybe come to what has been the specific sticking points that led to the failure of the Geneva meeting.
So Kunal, if you just remember, any constant watcher of the Hindu probably would have would be reminded of how we had a similar conversation when the plastics treaty negotiations were on in Busan in South Korea in December, and unfortunately, the outcomes of both the Busan talks as well as the one in Geneva were pretty much the same. And the conflicting points are also pretty much the same. So what happened is that in 2022, the United Nations Environmental Assembly, they passed a resolution, and this was unanimously backed by nearly 190 countries, that plastic pollution has to be addressed. It is a problem. It is a problem which has global ramifications, and the world has to do something about it. This was kind of uncontroversial. What follows after that is, following a resolution, you have to then draft a legal agreement which is actually binding on all countries. And to do that, they set up something called the Intergovernmental Negotiations Committee, which consists of basically representatives from all governments who are kind of UN members. Now the INC had decided unanimously that they would evolve a treaty within 5 sessions. But there has been a big problem, because what all the countries agreed to was addressing plastic pollution. Now here's where blocks of countries differ. You mentioned the like-minded countries. The more uncharitable term for them is also called the Low Ambition Coalition, as opposed to something called
the High Ambition Coalition, right? The question is, why did the talks stall? The High Ambition Coalition wants binding targets on reducing plastics production, phasing out toxic chemicals, and recognizing plastics as a health hazard. They argue recycling alone cannot keep pace when production already stands at 460 million tons a year, out of which only 9% is recycled and around 20 million tons leak into our rivers and oceans annually. The like-minded forum rejects this. For them, plastic pollution is a waste management issue and not a production issue. They want the treaty to focus on recycling systems and circular economy models. Many of these countries are oil producers or have large petrochemical industries, so cutting plastics production would hurt their economies. And Jacob, this sounds like a numbers game too. If the High Ambition Coalition has 80 to 100 countries on its side, shouldn't they just win a vote?
They are actually, I mean, in terms, if there was a voting process, for instance, and the voting was a simple majority, they would win. But the concept of voting itself is one of the things that the treaty is debating on. And this is also a common problem, by the way, in the climate COPs. So everybody has to agree. Everybody has equal voting powers, irrespective of the size of your country and population economy. So the high ambition guys basically are insistent that if you want to address plastic pollution, you absolutely have to cut plastic production. Whereas what you call the like-mindeds or these countries, they are also coincidentally all the countries that are oil producing states, or they have major petrochemical refining industries where they process the crude oil to make polymer, and that is where India comes in.
Now, what is India's position on this issue? India has firmly aligned itself with the like-minded group. As I said earlier, it argues the focus should be on recycling and circularity and not on production cuts. Officials point to bans on certain single-use plastics and to extended producer responsibility rules that require companies to collect back a portion of the plastics they sell. But the reality is different. Enforcement of the single-use ban has been patchy. The EPR system is plagued by fake certificates and weak monitoring. A trading mechanism was meant to incentivize recycling, but in practice, the informal sector still does most of the work. Waste pickers handle the bulk of plastic collection in India, often without protective gear or stable incomes, while formal systems remain too costly.
Yes. So in fact, that's the $1 million question. So India has actually gone ahead and banned nearly 22 kind of items called single-use plastics. All your paper cups and straws and festoons and etc. And these are very widely used articles. And nearly 20 states have implemented some version of these bans. In general, their commitment is that we will not produce any of these items. The problem with single-use plastic is that it is very light plastic, so it does not make enough economic sense for waste pickers to spend considerable amounts of their day collecting all of this light plastic when they're actually going to be remunerated only by kilo. So they'd rather go for heavier plastics or heavier bottles, PET bottles, etc., that can be sold back to companies for recycling. So this is what leads visually to the problem. Now, India has tried to bring in a market-based solution for this. So we have an extended producer responsibility where companies, especially consumer-facing companies, in retail, like the Amazon or Samsung, etc., they all have been given targets that they have to collect a certain percentage of sales every year, that in terms of recollecting the plastic packaging that they use in their products. Now the problem again with this is that they have been given targets, and it is very much akin to the system of carbon credits. Now this has only been in place for about 2.5 years, and we've seen evidence that it's not really been executed very well on the ground. Lots and lots of lakhs of fake certificates have been unearthed, and that's primarily because the amount of informal recycling of waste in India is so huge that starting a formal company to collect waste, their costs will always exceed what your average raddiwala or your average waste picker can do. So the collection ecosystem just does not work at all.
Now, coming to circularity and recycling challenges. In theory, recycling and circularity could help. But in practice, only about 9 to 10% of plastics worldwide are recycled. Most single-use plastics are too cheap and too lightweight to recover profitably. Even advanced economies struggle with this. Across the global south, informal waste pickers shoulder the burden of picking them. As consumption rises sharply in India, Indonesia, and across Africa, the system is breaking down. OECD projections suggest plastic use will more than double in sub-Saharan Africa and in fact triple in Asia by 2060, while barely rising in Europe or North America. Activists argue this makes recycling a distraction. The volumes are simply too much, they say. What are the alternatives to plastic? If cutting production is politically impossible, what could replace plastics? Some advocate going back to glass or aluminium, but both come with environmental costs. Glass requires huge energy inputs and could fuel illegal sand mining, while aluminium means more mining and higher emissions. Jacob, you mentioned some people are looking at bamboo or even microbes to make bioplastics. Where does that stand?
That is what makes it such a challenging problem, Kunal. So there are two basic ways that people are looking at, in terms of solutions that are being proposed. One is that let's go back to the way things were. I mean, let's start using glass bottles again. Let's start using aluminum bottles again, and all of these.
But then that has its own attendant carbon emissions. Like how do we address that? It has a huge impact on the environment all over again.
Completely. I mean, let's say aluminum is going to lead to more mining. Let's say if you are looking at glass, it will lead to more illegal sand mining. Which is already. I mean, even without all of this is a completely different issue. On itself. So one is this which I think is not very well thought through. Let's revert back to what we did before. So that is one way.
Yeah.
The second, the more futuristic, scientific, technological approach is that people say that, hey, so what is plastic? I mean, plastic basically it boils down to polymers like ethylene or polythene, and polymers themselves are little groups and chains of carbon, monomers. Now, monomers are a natural product. I mean, everything that is made of protein comes from monomers. So even your plants and your coir or cloth or whatever it is, cellulose, they are all monomers. Now, they are saying that instead of getting our monomers from fossil fuel, why don't we get our monomers from living organic substances? So, for example, one example that people talk of is bamboo. So there is bamboo, which is a very hardy tree, grass, depending on how you look at it. What if we evolve a larger system around taking, cultivating bamboo and thinking of better ways to process it? The second way is people believe that there are newer kinds of bacteria or microorganisms that if you process in sufficient quantities, they can be coaxed into releasing, biodegradable, monomers and polymers. But, in fact, some companies actually have made, in India itself, have made processing plants and they have made products out of it. But they have not been approved by the Central Pollution Control Board yet. Because one of the challenges is that these companies, at least from the Indian government's view, they have not yet proved that the biodegradable product that they make is 100% biodegradable. So, for example, you can see a biodegradable product, a cup made of biodegradable plastic. Let's say once it's just thrown off, it will 99% of it might be decomposed within, let's say, a couple of years. But then it can just stay at 99%. And it doesn't mean that within 2 years the 99 will become 100%. So you really don't have these kinds of replacements yet.
One of the most contentious questions is whether plastics should be treated as a health hazard at all. The High Ambition Coalition says yes, citing evidence of microplastics in blood, breast milk, and even human placenta. Studies have linked additives such as bisphenols and phthalates to endocrine disruption, fertility problems, cancers, and developmental disorders. But much of the evidence is associative. Scientists cannot yet prove causation, just as tobacco took decades to be definitively linked to lung cancer. The plastics industry has long downplayed risks, promoted recycling as a false solution, and shifted blame to consumers.
So the whole question of biodegradability itself is now, is a very contested idea. I mean, when you say something is degradable, the common sense view of it is that over time, if something was placed on the ground and you went back after a certain amount of time, that thing should have just disappeared. I mean, the equivalent of water getting evaporated by the sun. There's no trace of that water left. I mean, that's the common sense idea of degradability. But as paradoxically, as technology improves, we are able to observe things at finer and more atomic levels. So, for example, a piece of plastic might have vanished completely, but if you have the technology to observe it at the molecular level, you can find microplastics. It is present at a micrometer level. There have been groups of scientists, all concentrated largely in the developed world, but there have been groups of scientists who have been studying this. They're looking at people, for example, in consumerist societies where everything is wrapped in plastic, in single-use plastic, and they have determined certain health outcomes. For example, in terms of autism, there are studies that look at finding the trace of these chemicals in breast milk, in sperm quality. They have all of these studies, and they have really only shown that yes, even in for example, in inside babies, you are able to find microplastic concentrations, and at the end of it comes down to these polymers, like small polymers. But now whether that has actually gone ahead and caused serious health harms, has it really disrupted their bodily systems to a level where they would have been normal if they had not been exposed in the first place? We don't know. These are what is called associative studies. So in fact, the best analogy I've been able to think about it is the evidence that piles up vis-a-vis smoking. I mean, it took a long time to actually show that cigarette smoking was linked to an elevated risk, or tobacco consumption was linked to an elevated risk of cancers, of different kinds of cancer. But on the other hand, we all can always point to people who smoke a pack a day for the past 50 years, and they've just gone on to live lives like non-smokers, and vice versa. Absolute non-smokers, who have succumbed to cancer. And but ultimately, it does not really, for society to decide whether something is harmful or not, it really doesn't wait for that kind of conclusive evidence.
What is then the bigger picture? Plastic is now a $1 trillion global trade with 460 million tons produced each year, and only a fraction is recycled. Around 20 million tons leak into oceans and rivers annually. For island nations, this is not abstract, it is plastics waste washing up on their shores every day. The Geneva talks ended without agreement, just like Busan. A fifth and a half session, INC 5.3, is expected, though no date or venue has been announced. There is speculation the format may change if consensus proves impossible.
So they haven't decided yet. The meeting has been technically called adjourned. So in theory, it means that it will move to a 5.3, but that's what we speculate. Who knows? Maybe there might be an entire change in the negotiation committee's board. You might have a new chair of proceedings. Maybe they'll decide that this is probably not the best way to go forward, or they'll just do a 5.3 with some better preparatory activity. Because you're seeing that you've tried a particular method for about 5 times, and if it's not working, do you keep doing the same thing, or do you take a call that we have to do something different? I mean, that's what the UN has to essentially see.
What began in 2022 with high hopes of a landmark treaty is now mired in procedural delays, economic self-interest, and power of the petrochemical lobby. The world knows the stakes: plastic waste choking oceans, microplastics entering into our bodies, and an industry that mirrors tobacco in denial and delay. Yet the path to a binding treaty remains elusive. And that is all we have on this episode of The Climate Economy. If you like this video and want to hear more about how climate change is reshaping our economies, hit the bell icon on the Hindu's YouTube channel. Write to us, or better still, send us a video recording of your questions to climateeconomy@thehindu.co.in, and we will do our best to feature them. Bye for now.